what was the most painful thing you saw in your journey through these monuments?
Lawrence, there were a number. Certainly in Montgomery, being at that memorial for those who've been lynched, almost 4,000 people lynched, and to see the names of people who came from the county where my great-grandparents lived and where my great uncle was killed. But certainly walking on those plantation grounds, they're so genteel and so beautiful, but that belies the great violence, right? These are hallowed grounds, forced labor camps, really. To talk to men who, believe and love the mythology of what we say America was and what they say the Confederacy was. But it was violence and pillage and raping. And to look me in my eyes and with an air of something ethereal, speak of the past in such glorious ways, knowing that my people struggled to survive, were brutally murdered, and worked to build what America is today. I think that was the most painful. This charade, this veil, the lies that these men tell themselves and pass on to their children, not just in the huge obelisk, but in the reenactment, in the passing down of that legacy. It was really tough, but I think, every step along the way, there were moments of great pain.
Caroline, what were you thinking and feeling as you were watching Tremaine's journey tonight?
I was thinking about that line the guy said where he said that you have to get into a 19th century mind, into an 18th century mind. And what was implicit in what he said was a white 19th century mind, a white 18th century mind. Because if he'd been able to get into a Black American 19th century mind, he would not be able to engage in that exercise and look a Black man in his house in his face and try to justify the reenactments that he's undertaken. That's what I was thinking.
But on that point, Caroline, there were white 19th century minds who were completely opposed to slavery, including relatives of Robert E. Lee himself living in the South, who were opposed to slavery and were opposed to the war that he was fighting.
Well, right. So it's actually, again, this implicit fetishization of a slave-holding, slavery-celebrating mentality. And I'm also thinking about the guy, Mr. Cotton, like the socks. You don't have to say like you pick, but anyway.
Like you pick.
I was thinking about what he said. And I was thinking, he said it's about money. But then he stops there. He doesn't say, well, what was the primary source of Southern American money, right? He doesn't examine it to its root to acknowledge that what he is celebrating when he celebrates the cause, what he is arguing when he argues that it was economic, he's still arguing on behalf of slavery.
Tremaine, speaking to Jefferson Davis' great-great-grandson, was that a surprising conversation for you?
It was pretty surprising because you'd have to imagine how revered Jefferson Davis still is in those spaces. You think about guys like Mr. Cotton and our reenactor. They revere this man. He's a hero. And so that a descendant of Jefferson Davis wants to separate himself in some way from that legacy was very interesting. But it wasn't a full-throated, dismissal of everything he believed in. This was a softer, gentler kind of embrace of his relative and his ancestor. So he still loves and honors this man. He had more nuance than some of the others. But he wasn't necessarily distancing himself because his whole thing was there was all this time before. He was a great man who had a short period that did a bad thing, as opposed to an entire life building up to this moment where he boldly proclaimed himself the president of this nation that had the right, by all means necessary, to own people, to sell people, to do what they will. And I think what Caroline said earlier, and as you mentioned, Lawrence, this idea of men of their times, there were men of their times who also were fighting this and as abolitionists. And so the contradictions, but also the mistelling, misremembering, miseducation of history The mythology surrounding this, and go back to Mr. Cotton, like you pick. He's a pillar in this community. We went to 3 or 4 different places, and they said, oh, you got to talk to Mr. Cotton. You got to find Mr. Cotton. So we go deep in the woods where the cell phones don't work, and we pull up on this guy's front porch unannounced, lets us in. We have the minstrel, a bunch of CDs of people in blackface. You have the Confederate flag. You have that pickaninny. And he kind of laughed and showed it to me and kind of chuckled. This is a pillar in this community. And so we're wrestling with the idea of these monuments. But what lives inside these men that they pass on is almost as troubling.
Caroline, you grew up in the South. You live in the South now. What is it that most people miss when they look at this? I'm sure, as someone who is a Southerner yourself, especially people like me from the North, as we look at these things, is there kind of a constant reframing you want to do for us?
Of course there is, Lawrence. When I think about Mr. Cotton, when I think about the other gentleman who's doing this reenacting, I think that what we have to remember is that these men have preserved this ideology so successfully because they turn our idea of, they're saying you're going to erase our history. And what they're saying actually is, you're trying to revise, edit, and fact check a history that we already approved and that our ancestors wrote. And they're not actually allowing for the proper editorial process of how something successful gets written to be undertaken. They want to have us accept their narrative wholesale. And it's been accepted wholesale up to this point. And I think that it's now time for us all to be responsible documentarians of the actual bones of their narrative.
Caroline, one of the comments I was struck by early in Tremaine's documentary was the woman who compared the way the South treats this history to the way Germany treats their Nazi history. That's a point you made on this show in your first appearance. Yeah,
that line struck me dumb the first time I watched this documentary, because that auction block is just sitting without any context in the middle of a cheerful square. Last I checked, Auschwitz, Dachau, the camps that have become museums to honor the people who were murdered there, the genocide that was undertaken there, to demand reproach for the soldiers who committed those atrocities, those places have been put into context. They are solemn and they are rigorous in discussing the horrors. That's just a little cheerful block in the middle of a little cheerful Southern quaint street. And she just says, wasn't that lovely that you can touch history? You can see where somebody might have been sold. But there's no demanding of context, and there's no demanding of context because she knows, and we all know, that it was left there to intimidate, to shame, to harrow, right? It's not the same at all.